afternoon, everybody. It is Monday the 22nd of August and it's Dram 212. Continuing our Canadian theme, we are going to go for a half miniature because the donator Andrew P. Butler has already had half of it himself. It's only fair that he has some before donating it to me. Did I say Andrew P. Butler? Andrew A. P. Butler. Do apologise, Andrew, if I've said that again. So Gooderham Worts is actually, if you're Canadian, if you're watching from Canada, you've probably heard of Gooderham Worts, or you would have heard of potentially the Gooderham building, which is in Toronto. Now, Gooderham Worts, Worts is James Worts, who was an Englishman, used to live in Suffolk. And in 1831, he moved to Toronto, which is here in Canada. And in Suffolk, he owned a mill and opened a new mill in Toronto. Basically, sort of emigrated over there and set up with his brother-in-law, a guy called William Gooderham, who partnered him with the mill. So it was predominantly flour and grains. And they had a windmill in order to get the whole machinations going. Now, sadly, in 1834, his wife Elizabeth died during childbirth, and James's wife died during childbirth. And 2 weeks later, James himself committed suicide by throwing himself down the well of the windmill. So William Gooderham ran it until 1845 before he handed it over to James Worts' eldest son, who was also called James. Now, James took the name James Gooderham Worts as a double-barrelled surname, even though technically he was a Worts, and that's where the name of the company originated from. So they had a surplus wheat stock, and James began to look at distilling, and in 1859 it became that viable that they actually built a new distillery complex which was on the waterfront in Toronto, and still part of it still stands to this day, and it's actually known as the distillery district in Toronto. So it was a really good place geographically as well, because it was on the waterfront, so they had a good water source, and it was also quite close to the railways, which gave them rail links to not the whole of the country, but very good rail links to export. And by 1900 they were actually producing half of the spirits that Canada made. Of all the spirit that was made in Canada, I keep wanting to say Canada, that was made in Canada, they made half of it. So it was a pretty big operation. Now, the temperance movement in Canada, which was also prevalent in the US, actually started to knock them back, and demand began to fall. Toronto itself was hit with a bill where basically they couldn't sell alcohol within that area. They used to have to basically send it up to Quebec and then get it back down again. So it was they were really getting hit. And in 1923, the company was bought by a guy called Harry Hatch for $1.25 million. Now, 2 years later, he also bought the Hiram Walker company, Hiram Walker and Sons, and the conglomerate became known as Hiram Walker, Gooderham and Worts. Hang on, Worts and Gooderham. Which way? Yeah, Gooderham Worts. Hiram Walker, Gooderham and Worts Limited. Worts. There's a T in it. So it carried on as it was kind of always over the years. It began to lose its luster and lose its power. In 1987, the company itself was bought by Allied Lions, which was a British company. If you're from the UK, you may well have heard of it back in the day. But in 1990, the distillery itself closed down. It was surplus to requirements. There was no demand for it. American whiskey was big. Scotch whiskey was big. The 70s to 80s was quite difficult for Scotch producers. American producers was just about going on, and Canadian whiskey was really down in the dumps. So Hiram Walker carried on. Canadian Club was a much bigger brand, and that managed to hold its own. They're now owned by Pernod Ricard. Now, there's an offshoot of Hiram Walker called Corby Distillers, who is essentially a distribution company. And just before the turn of the millennium, in fact, I think it was 2000, they launched it. They tried to revitalise some premium Canadian whiskies, one of which was called Lot 40, which you're going to come across in a couple of days, and also Gooderham Worts. Now, it didn't really pay off, and it sort of fell by the wayside. It lasted for about 8-9 years and then disappeared. But recently they've been relaunched because there is now a demand for premium whisky. Canadian whisky is starting to get more popular because world whiskies are getting more popular. It's not just Scotch and Irish and American. The world whisky market is growing exponentially. So Corby Distillers have relaunched Lot 40 and Gooderham Worts. Now this is a blended Canadian whisky which is 45%, interestingly, not 40%, and it's also small batch. Now apparently this is proper small batch, according to some blurb on the Whisky Exchange. And I don't know how much it is on the Whisky Exchange because they've sold out, and I couldn't actually find a price for this anywhere. The bottle is basically, well, I'll put a picture up of what it looks like. It's sort of a stumpier version of the miniature, but it's a blend of only 10 barrels at a time. It's really, really small batch. They take 10 barrels and blend them together and then bottle that. So when it's small batch, this is small batch with every single meaning. So corn, rye, barley. They actually do a Gooderham Worts called 4 grain, where they have a wheat in there as well, which is quite highly regarded. But this is the version that I've got from Andrew. So interesting that it's 45%, and you know, this is for Canadian blended whiskey. This is premium Canadian blended whiskey. Like I say, I've no idea how much this is. I found the only place I found it where it had a price was actually an Australian merchant, and that was 69 Aussie dollars. But God knows what. I'm going to guess maybe 35 Canadian dollars, $40, something like that. I'm not actually sure what the exchange rate is between US dollars and Canadian dollars, and the way that the pound's going at the moment, it could be like 1-to-1 very, very shortly. So, oh, that really caught me in the eyes. Now, this smells to me quite high rye content. There's a definite rye bread, brown bread, slightly sourdough character, but it's not too sour. There's a bit of a kick to this as well, really is at the back of the nose and sort of making my eyes water a little bit. It's definitely noses more than 45%, but it's not a spiritiness. There is fire there and there is heat, but there is a good balance to it. Ooh, now that is very interesting indeed. There's a really thick mouthfeel to it, and just before you're about to swallow, there's a lovely sweetness to it, and it's not quite Parma Violets, but it's that slightly floral sweetness. Now, I don't really like Parma Violets, but this has got elements of it, but it works really well. There is a definite sweet floral character to it, as well as this nice prickle of rye, this effervescence of kind of rye character and rye bread. Very, very interesting indeed. There's a lovely toffee caramel smoothness to it as well, and it's like a dark chocolate caramel. Dark chocolate with a really, really rich, creamy, soft caramel interior. But there is also a nice bit of heat from the 45% ABV. There's a slight dryness because of this rye character to it. Really well balanced. There's flavours dancing around all over the place. Now, so far the Canadian blended whiskies that I've had have not been brilliant. A couple have been okay, but they've not been a good advert for it. This is really good. This is really, really interesting. There's about 3 or 4 different flavours going on, and they marry really well. They dance between them. One doesn't overpower the other. It's not too sweet. It's not too heavily rye. it's not too fiery. Everything works really, really well. The finish is pretty decent. It's not massively long, but it does linger enough to give you a pleasant sensation. And the finish is pretty much rye bread more than anything else. That's really good. Tell you what it reminds me a little bit of, actually, the flavour as well, is there's those caramelised biscuits that you tend to get with coffees in fancy hotels. Is it Biscoff? And they do, they've only recent, maybe in the last 2 years, they do a spread version of it. So, you know, like peanut butter, that sort of thing. Biscoff do a spreadable version. And it's very much like that. It's sort of slightly caramelised, slightly sugary, but slightly bready as well. That's a really good whiskey, and that's a really good Canadian, and for a blended whiskey, that's absolutely fantastic. Really good stuff. We don't know where you can find it. If you can find it, do pick it up, because it's a fantastic whiskey. Very, very good indeed. Andrew, thank you very much for that. I'd love to know what you thought of it, because I think that's very, very good, and that's a cracking advert for Canadian whiskey. Right, quick rinse out, and I'll crack on with one that I don't have anywhere near as much information as this one on. So I'll see you then. Cheers.